Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is December 20th, 2017. I have a series of things that I would like to cover with you here before I get to the main issue of the day. And there's so much in the news right now, so many things going on. It is absolutely incredible, off the walls. But sometimes I like to bounce back and forth between covering things that are currently in the news and then other things that are perennial issues of ongoing interest. So one of the things that I may cover in the upcoming days and weeks, perhaps even months, considering it is difficult for me to schedule time to record these shows. Here's one from 2006. It was, I hesitate to even name the source, New York Times. But the article is actually a good one. That is a rarity for them, but it is because it's not in the political arena in general. But it's called What's Wrong with a Child? Psychiatrists Often Disagree. And it talks about issues of, say, the same patient goes to see multiple psychiatrists and then ends up with different diagnoses, which of course can have tremendous long-term individual effects. Another one is an article that was published with Psychiatry MMC, which is a peer-reviewed journal providing evidence-based information to practicing clinicians. And it's on the same issue. This was published January 2006. The Reliability of Psychiatric Diagnosis Revisited, the Clinician's Guide to Improve the Reliability of Psychiatric Diagnosis. And you can tell the obvious import of that if you get it wrong. Here's another one from The Atlantic. This is from May 2nd, 2017. The Real Problems with Psychiatry. A psychotherapist contends that the DSM, Psychiatry's Bible that defines all mental illness, is not scientific, but a product of unscrupulous politics and bureaucracy. Fascinating material there. Another one, this is from Dialogues in Clinical Neuroscience. This was published March 2015, The History of Nosology, The Rise of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it traces sort of the deep history of how this came about. And I may cover that one. Here's one from the American Psychiatric Association, the APA, Psychiatric News. It's from March 15, 2002. Where it notes that mental illness is on the rise on college campuses. Boy, are we ever seeing the results of that today. And has it gotten any better? Doesn't seem so. Here is something on genetic conditions and how they are tied to particular ethnic groups. I may cover that. Here is another one on sex and gender differences in health, because you have very obvious and different health outcomes and prescriptions for people based on whether they are male or female. And this was from 2012, before we got into this hypermania of multiple genders, which, when it comes to homicide cases or medical science, is a big problem if you don't have the correct gender. Here's one that is currently in the news about taxation. A column is called How Much Do the Poor Actually Pay in Taxes? And it's probably more than you think. And this one is really good because there's this annoying tendency with conservative talk radio show hosts is they like to throw it out there that well, the poor don't pay anything in taxes. The poor never pay anything in taxes, right? Well, what they're talking about are the federal income taxes. And most of these people actually are taxed on that on the front end. It comes out of the check before they actually ever receive the check, and then they do get that given back to them usually at the end of the year. But you can't say that they don't pay any taxes because you have all kinds of sales taxes, etc., that they cannot avoid because it's on necessities, and life necessities, of course, cost the poor relatively more than they do the wealthy. And they neglect to mention that, and it is much to my chagrin. Here's another one called, Is a Consumption Tax Fair? talks about the many problems with consumption taxes. Of course, I'm a libertarian. I'm against all taxes on principle, but what have you. And the last thing here, who really receives welfare and government entitlements, and it's a very interesting statistical breakdown of who receives how much and when and why. So that is fascinating. Now, as we transition from that set of preliminaries to another set of preliminaries, I want to tell you that this is going to be quite long. If you are at home, maybe you should get some tea or some coffee, settle in with a pen and paper to take notes and follow along. If you're riding to or from work, this should be great. It should get you there and probably back as well. Now, what I'm going to talk about here is an article titled The Cycle of Classification, DSM 1 through DSM 5. The authors are Roger K. Blashfield, Jared W. Keeley, Elizabeth H. Flanagan, and Shannon R. Miles. Now, this was put out by a publication called Annual Review of Clinical Psychology, Volume 10, 2014. I believe that was in March of 2014. And I will source cite all of the material at the bottom of the link so that you can go straight to it and read it for yourself if you so wish. Now, this is pages 25 to 51 out of something like an 800 plus page publication. So I don't think that it goes over anything that would be a problem for, say, fair use in relation to copyright. I have written to them seeking permission to record this and put it out. But as I read more about annual reviews, they put out all kinds of material, not just on psychology, but all of the sciences and whatnot in general. It's a fascinating company. It says that it is a nonprofit publisher for science and the benefit of society. And it appears that many of the journals are now open access journals. I did try to make an individual purchase of this article, but the link was broken. I found a free copy through the university, I believe it was actually Arizona State University. And this is one of the top cited journals in the field of psychology. And it's for good reason. You know, the example that I have here is absolutely fantastic. Grade A scholarship. This is the way it ought to be done, let me tell you. And I really couldn't pick up on too much about whatever their political biases may be. I don't know these people. I'm sure other people within the field could tell you where they stand on various things. I don't know because I am not in that field. And I have no training, of course, in clinical psychology or anything like that. I did study a few psychology courses at university, but that is not my particular area. My areas are history and philosophy, specifically the history of ideas, and more specifically the history of science. So this aspect of it does fall into something that I know about, at least in terms of how you do the research and how you do the writing. And I'll be covering all of this simply for the purposes of education, for commentary, and criticism. All right, so here is a bit of information on each of the authors. Blashfield gives an address here listed in Oregon, but his email address is Auburn University, so I suspect that's where he is. Keeley at the Department of Psychology, Mississippi State University. Flanagan, Department of Psychiatry, Yale University School of Medicine. And Miles, Department of Psychology, University of Tulsa. Has a short abstract here, which generally the lead author draws up on these. It says, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, was created in 1952 by the American Psychiatric Association so that mental health professionals in the United States would have common language to use when diagnosing individuals with mental disorders. Since the initial publication of the DSM, there have been 5 subsequent editions of this manual published, including the DSM-3-R. This review discusses the structural changes in the 6 editions and the research that influenced those changes. Research is classified into 3 domains. A, issues related to the DSMs as measurement systems. B, studies of clinicians and how clinicians form diagnoses. And C, taxonomic issues involving the philosophy of science and meta-theoretical ideas about how classification systems function. The review ends with recommendations about future efforts to revise the DSM. All right, so we begin. The classification of psychopathology is integral to the science and practice of clinical psychology as well as all behavioral health disciplines. In the United States, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, has been the official American classification scheme since its inception in 1952. The fifth edition of this system was recently released, DSM-5, in 2013. Understanding the history of the DSM editions is important owing to their influence over diagnostic practice and research. The conceptual and methodological struggles of earlier editions of the DSM still apply, and thus the oft-quoted piece of wisdom attributed to Edmund Burke pertains. Those who do not know history are destined to repeat it. However, the entirety of those influences is too vast to cover in a single article. Thus, the current review focuses on the major environmental pressures that led to the creation of each edition of the DSM, as well as the research between editions centering on the themes of measurement, clinicians' diagnostic practices, and the taxonomic underpinnings of the manual. Prior to 1900, psychiatrists were few and far between and usually relegated to the large state hospitals and asylums for the severely mentally ill. Psychoanalysis had not yet been created, and hardly any psychiatrists were engaged in outpatient psychotherapy. Naturally, these psychiatrists were more interested in the pragmatic aspects of managing an asylum and were less interested in academic pursuits. Thus, there was little interest in nosology, the branch of science dealing with the classification of disease, beyond how it would be practically useful in managing patients and performing administrative duties. In this context, as Grove, 1991, notes, diagnosis was a primary concern for psychiatrists, not only insofar as it served a practical purpose. Psychiatrists were well aware of the problems in defining mental disorder categories, so the classification of mental disorders tended to be general and fluid. Classifications made on the basis of symptom descriptions led to much overlap of diagnostic categories, which often caused the diagnosis of one psychiatrist to be radically different from that of another. The problem of diagnostic agreement among clinicians would continue to plague psychiatric classification for years to come. Further, classifications on the basis of etiology of psychopathology were not possible, for theories of cause were speculative at best. However, psychiatrists of the time did value the role statistics could play in advancing the field. Statistics could shed light on prevalence rates, demographic patterns in mental illness and disease course, and thus create a case for public policy and increased funding. But the collection of such statistical data requires categories, so mental disorder classifications were considered a necessary evil and kept as simple as possible to limit any negative effects. Research prior to DSM-1. A study from the 1930s that still has relevance to modern research was performed by a Catholic priest, Thomas V. More, 1930-1933. More gathered data on 367 psychotic patients from 2 mental institutions in the Washington, D.C. area. Probably a lot more than that today. His descriptive data included 40 symptoms for which he provided prose definitions of what the symptoms meant, scores on cognitive ability tests, and behavior rating scales. By hand computation, More performed a factor analysis on the correlation matrix of these variables. Moore, in 1930, interpreted his results as yielding 8 factors that he named: A. Cognitive defect, B. Catatonic syndrome, C. Uninhibited or kinetic syndrome, D. Non-euphoric manic syndrome, E. Euphoric manic syndrome, F. Delusional hallucinatory syndrome, G. Syndrome of constitutional hereditary depression, and H. Syndrome of retarded depression. These symptom groupings corresponded to similar diagnostic constructs common in inpatient psychiatry at the time and provided evidence in support of grouping symptoms into identifiable syndromes. Moore was ahead of his time when it came to thinking about psychopathology in terms of dimensions, and we begin with him as an example of psychiatry's struggle with how best to measure psychopathology. However, the factors identified in his research were not particularly stable. Moore, 1933, added some additional data, used a different method to calculate item intercorrelations, and generated a new factor analysis solution. The famous factor analytics researcher Thurstone, 1934, published his own analysis of the Moore data, which yielded 5 factors. 2 additional reanalyses of the Moore data were published by Deegan, 1952, and by Blashfield, 1984. Deegan argued for 9 factors, whereas Blashfield favored 5 factors, similar to those reported by Thurstone. The specific factors are not as important as how these reanalyses highlight the fact that methodological choices and researcher preconceptions likely had a strong influence upon the resulting solution. DSM-1. After World War II, American psychiatry was embarrassed by the chaotic state of classification in the United States. 4 systems were in use across different sectors of the mental health field. The American Psychiatric Association, APA, decided to overcome this Tower of Babel situation by creating a classification that would be acceptable to all members of its organization and that could unify the diagnostic terms of its psychiatrists. The result was the DSM, later renamed the DSM-1 because it was the first edition in a series of substantive revisions to this manual, kind of like Star Wars. And here, just as an aside, something that pops into my mind when, thinking about some of the stuff that we've covered so far is how best is it that you refer to these? Is it best to refer to it as a disease? Because disease has connotations of something like polio, right? Or HIV or something. But, is it better to just refer to it as psychological disorder? I don't know. Something to think about. So we continue here. The DSM-1 contained 128 categories and was published as a smallish 132 pages paperback book that cost $3. Remember all of this. This will be important later. Organizationally, the DSM-1 had a hierarchical system in which the initial node in the hierarchy was differentiating organic brain syndromes from functional disorders. The functional disorders were further subdivided into psychotic versus neurotic versus character disorders. This organization roughly followed the decision-making process of clinicians. The DSM-1 descriptions of disorders were prose paragraphs that incorporated behavioral and trait-like criteria. 93 of the 128 categories in this system had prose descriptions. These descriptions were very short, rarely over 200 words, and added little to what meaning could be derived from the name of the disorder. The terms in the description were relative and left to the interpretation of the clinician, leading to problems with reliability across professionals. An example of a DSM-1 description for the diagnosis of psychophysiologic cardiovascular reaction follows. This category includes such types of cardiovascular disorders as paroxysmal tachycardia, hypertension, vascular spasms, migraine, and so forth, in which emotional factors play a causative role. That is not great. In retrospect, the DSM-1 had an inpatient psychiatry focus. This edition focused mainly on the organic and psychotic disorders. The inpatient focus can also be seen by examining the miscellaneous categories in this system, such as transient, hospitalized only for psychological testing, and deceased at the time of examination. That would be a bit of scholarly dark humor for you. Research between DSM-1 and DSM-2. Measurement. Factor analytic descriptive research of psychopathology continued after the DSM-1 was published. Like Moore's original research, these later investigators performed descriptive studies of inpatients in either state or VA hospitals. Wittenborn, Lohr, and Overall were important researchers in this tradition, each of whom conducted a number of studies attempting to empirically create the optimal descriptive representations of severe forms of psychopathology. Another area of research that began during this time period focused on diagnostic reliability. The prototypical study in this tradition was performed by Philip Ash, 1949, as his master's thesis in industrial psychology at Pennsylvania State University. He gathered data on 3 psychiatrists who independently interviewed and diagnosed 52 applicants to the Central Intelligence Agency. Ash was surprised by the large amount of variance among psychiatrists in their diagnostic impressions of these different individuals. Ash concluded that psychiatric classification lacked adequate reliability when being used clinically to assign diagnoses. Ash's study, particularly his provocative finding of inadequate reliability, or interclinician agreement, stimulated a number of research studies that were performed in the 1950s through the 1970s. For detailed reviews of these studies, especially their methodological strengths and weaknesses, the interested reader should examine Matarazzo, 1978, and Zubin, 1967. Research on clinicians. Overall, 1963 conducted a study on how clinicians viewed psychopathology. At the time, Overall was a well-known researcher using factor analytic techniques to perform descriptive studies of the psychopathology of long-term psychiatric patients. He was also heavily involved in early studies on the effectiveness of the phenothiazines to treat schizophrenia. In his 1963 study, Overall used a scale he developed titled the Brief Psychiatric Rating Scale, BPRS, which rated the symptoms of these long-term patients on 16 dimensions. Overall asked 28 psychiatrists and 10 clinical psychologists to conceptualize, quote, typical patients for the functional psychoses recognized in the DSM-1. They then rated these typical patients on the dimensions of the BPRS. A discriminant analysis formed dimensions that optimally separated the 13 categories. In the resulting three-dimensional space, which accounted for 83% of the variance, the diagnoses, as viewed by the clinicians, coalesced into visual clusters. Thus, despite using a dimensional methodology, Overall demonstrated the power of a categorical model for describing the way clinicians think about diagnoses. Taxonomy. The World Health Organization, WHO, added a psychiatric section to its classification of medical disorders with a sixth version of the International Statistical Classification of Diseases and Related Health Problems, the ICD-6. However, this psychiatric classification proved to be a political failure because it was ignored by almost every country in the United Nations at the time. A British psychiatrist named Stengel, 1959, was asked to perform a thorough analysis of the psychiatric classifications that were used around the world. Stengel found that almost every country in the world had its own classification system, and some European countries had more than one. He was appalled at this multiplicity in diagnostic language. The DSM, from Stengel's perspective, provided a model of how the international community could proceed in trying to create a consensual system that would be adopted by every country in the world. DSM-2. Stengel's review became a call for action. The WHO funded a series of international committee meetings in which countries around the world worked to create a consensual system. The result was the ICD-8. The American version of the ICD-8 was the DSM-2. Although the DSM-2 and the ICD-8 were almost identical, a few differences did exist. The ICD-8 had a category for hysterical psychosis, which Americans thought was an oxymoron because hysteria was clearly a neurotic disorder. Also, Americans held onto a category that originated in military psychology called passive-aggressive personality disorder. Europeans thought that this diagnosis was pejorative and disingenuous. Finally, the DSM-2, like the DSM-1, did have short prose definitions of its categories. The ICD-8 was only a list of approved diagnostic terms. No attempt was made to define the terms in the ICD-8. The DSM-2 had, and this goes back to what I pointed out being important before in terms of the size and the cost, because that continues to come up. The DSM-2 had 193 diagnostic categories, of which 120 were defined using short prose presentations. Like the DSM-1, the DSM-2 was a paperback manual consisting of 119 pages and costing $3.50, and had a hierarchical organization. Unlike the DSM-1, many of the new categories added in the DSM-2 were categories of relevance to outpatient mental health efforts. Anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, personality disorders, designated as PDs, and disorders of childhood adolescence were larger subsets than they had been in the DSM-1. The other interesting change associated with the DSM-2 concerned the miscellaneous categories. Because the ICD-8 was trying to create an international system that could be used around the world, the ICD-8 had diagnostic code numbers associated with every category. These code numbers, written in a decimal format, were constant regardless of how a category was named within a particular language. There were two major types of miscellaneous categories in the ICD-8. The first were category code names that ended in .8. The 8 after the decimal point meant that the category was a unique diagnosis for that country. This coding solution allowed different countries to keep diagnostic categories that were commonly used in those countries, even though these categories were not part of the consensual international system. The second type of miscellaneous category were those that ended in .9. And they were wastebasket categories that included all patients who fit within a particular family of mental disorders, but who did not match the definition of any of the specific categories within that family, e.g. the patient had a PD, personality disorder, but did not have any of the 7 specific PDs listed in the ICD-8. Today, the miscellaneous category is called Not Otherwise Specified, NOS. Of note, both kinds of categories are still used in the ICD. And a note that I wrote out here to the side is that one of the things that you're going to notice about the DSMs is that they have like movie sequel syndrome, which are characterized by bigger and more of it. Bigger explosions, more explosions. If you had an alien, you have lots of aliens for the sequel, right? So we continue. Research between the DSM-2 and the DSM-3. Taxonomy. In 1973, Rosenhan published a provocative paper in Science about how a group of colleagues went to different inpatient facilities in the United States requesting admission. And this is where it gets really interesting, folks. They were truthful about themselves during the intake interview except for two things. A, they gave fictitious names so that their admissions would not appear on their future medical records, for obvious reasons. And B, they reported hearing a voice saying empty or thud. All were admitted with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Their average length of stay in the inpatient facility was 19 days. And one of these people was really committed. The total range was 7 to 52 days. 52 days! When discharged, most of them were given a diagnosis of schizophrenia in remission. Rosenhan and his colleagues noted that most of the patients in the facilities spotted that they were fakes, but none of the pseudo-patients were detected by the hospital staff. Major condemnation there. Rosenhan concluded that inpatient facilities of the time could not differentiate the sane from the insane. Rosenhan's paper stirred up a firestorm of protest. Robert Spitzer, who became the head of the DSM-3, wrote a detailed and scathing methodological critique of Rosenhan's study. An entire issue of the Journal of Abnormal Psychology was devoted to analyses of the Rosenhan study, along with a response by Rosenhan. The debate stimulated by the Rosenhan paper touched on central issues to taxonomy, such as how a mental disorder is or is not defined, what methodologies in studying mental disorders are considered scientific versus pseudoscience, and how the validity of particular diagnoses can be ascertained. The Rosenhan paper stimulated strong emotional responses within the field that have persisted even into the contemporary literature, and they give an example of it, Slater, 2004. And I wrote a note out here to the side too. I don't think they mention this in here anywhere, but I have heard separately that at the time, diagnoses between clinicians was no better than 50-50 chance. You could flip a coin, with Harvey Two-Face Dent, and you would get the same results as you would from going around to doctor. And here we continue. Research on clinicians. Overall and Woodward, 1975, performed a follow-up study to Overall, 1963. They had psychiatrists assign ratings to clusters of psychopathology and compare these ratings to data from 2,000 actual American and French patients. The descriptions the clinicians gave to psychopathology differed substantially from the patient ratings. These findings suggested that the conceptualizations held in psychiatrists' minds about different diagnostic categories were quite different from the way in which psychopathology actually appeared during patient assessments. And this is almost always the case in medicine, I will tell you. Another important paper that proved to be a stimulus for the changes in the DSM-3 was the US-UK International Diagnostic Project, Kendall et al., 1971. A set of 8 videotapes of patients from the United States and Great Britain were shown to groups of American and British psychiatrists. For all 8 videotapes, the modal diagnosis by the American clinicians was schizophrenia. In contrast, some of the videotapes, in the opinion of the British psychiatrists, represented patients with manic depressive disorders, schizophrenia, and personality disorders. In conjunction with Rosenhan, 1973, the US-UK project results were considered as further evidence that the Americans were sloppy diagnosticians who tended to be over-inclusive in their use of schizophrenia as a diagnosis. Here I wrote a note out to the side. Does this not ring a bell for you with, say, ADD and ADHD? Boy comes in. They say he has trouble focusing, trouble paying attention. Oh, we will write a prescription for that. Got it covered. ADD, ADHD, right? May not actually be what the problem is for the child. Happens all the time. We continue. Measurement. Aaron Beck was a psychiatrist who studied depressive disorders and who became famous for his advocacy of cognitive behavioral approaches to the treatment of depression. Relatively early in his research career, Beck and colleagues, in 1962, performed a study on the reliability of psychiatric diagnosis using outpatients who were being considered for a research trial with this cognitive behavioral therapy. Beck and his colleagues had the clinicians independently diagnose these outpatients and give reasons why they disagreed. Interestingly, clinicians most frequently felt that the fault for their diagnostic disagreements were the overly broad and non-specific diagnostic definitions that existed in the DSM-2. A number of subsequent research papers cited Beck et al. 1962 as evidence for a need to change the definitions in the DSM-2. In 1972, a group of psychiatrists at Washington University in St. Louis proposed a change that they hoped would lead to improvements in diagnostic reliability and also increase the specificity and meaning of contemporary diagnostic concepts, Feiner et al. 1972. In this paper, the Washington University group argued that there existed 15 mental disorder categories having sufficient evidence to assert that these categories were valid. Included in the 15 were schizophrenia, manic depressive disorder, homosexuality, and hysteria. These psychiatrists then proposed relatively specific operational definitions for these categories in the form of diagnostic criteria. They argued that any future research on these 15 mental disorders should use the diagnostic criteria to identify patient samples. The Feiner et al. 1972 study became the most highly cited paper in the psychiatric research literature of the time. And that brings us to the next section, DSM-3, or what I call the big revolutionary change. The classification that resulted from the research described above proved to be a truly revolutionary system. The earlier DSMs used short, broadly worded prose definitions to describe categories. The DSM-3, built on the innovation of the Feiner et al. Paper, contained diagnostic criteria to specify the meaning of the categories. In addition, for each category, there was a description of the typical demographic profile of patients experiencing this disorder, a lengthy prose explanation of what the category meant, a description of how to differentiate the target category from any other category with which it might be confused, and a brief discussion of what was known, if anything, about the course and onset of the disorder. Great. Sounds fantastic, doesn't it? Sounds so much better than the first two, and you would think a lot of this stuff would be what they thought of in the beginning, but I guess since they're not philosophically oriented people, that is something that blows right past them for many, many years. We continue. Another innovation in the DSM-3 was that the system was multi-axial. Each patient was expected to be diagnosed along 5 separate axes. A, the descriptive presentation of the patient, i.e. the mental disorder categories. B, the underlying personality and/or intellectual disorder. C, any associated medical disorder that was relevant to the patient's psychiatric presentation. D, the psychosocial stressors in the patient's environment. And E, the patient's highest level of adaptive functioning in the past year. Can they hold a job? Can they go to school? Right? Finally, the DSM-3 contained an extensive set of supplementary materials, e.g., a diagnostic flowchart that could be useful to clinicians and to public health officials, e.g. tables showing how the DSM-3 categories matched the ICD-8 categories, which are primarily used for insurance billing, which I think maybe they mention a little bit later. There were 228 categories of mental disorders in the DSM-3, 163 categories defined using diagnostic criteria, discussed in 494 pages. Notice the bloat there, making the size of the DSM-3 much larger than either the DSM-1 or 2, or in fact if they were combined. The price of the DSM-3 increased 9-fold to $31.75. Remember, before we were dealing with like less than $4. As shown in Table 1, which I won't review right now, the revenue generated by the DSM-3 also demonstrated a sizable increase. The higher-order hierarchical system of the DSM-1 and DSM-2 was dropped. Instead, the categories, some of which were not recognized by the international community, were organized into 19 families of disorders. Examples of exclusively American categories were borderline personality disorder, and that one is a doozy if you're familiar with what BPD is. Brief reactive psychosis, and psychogenic pain disorder. Consistent with the ICD, at the end of each chapter on a family of disorders, there were miscellaneous categories for patients whose symptoms met some of the diagnostic criteria in this family, but not in a sufficient number to obtain a specific diagnosis. These individuals were given the family disorder diagnosis with an additional specifier of not otherwise specified. And actually, I will go to the table here briefly. So DSM-1 publication date 1952, number of pages 132, number of diagnoses 128. Revenue for the APA was unknown at that time. DSM-2, publication date 1968, 119 pages, 193 diagnoses, $1.27 million of revenue. DSM-3, 1980 was the publication date. Number of pages, 494, number of diagnoses, 228, and revenue, $9.33 million. And there are more after that, which I won't go over at the moment. You can feel free to look them up if you wish. The explanation for the revolutionary nature of the DSM-3 extends far beyond the confines of what a classification does and is. Publishing the DSM-3 was part of a paradigm shift in psychiatry and the mental health field in general. Prior to the DSM-3, psychiatry was dominated by psychoanalytically trained psychiatrists who eschewed the ideas of Kraepelin. These psychoanalysts saw little value to clinical diagnosis for working with psychotherapy patients. In contrast, the main authors of the DSM-3 were the leaders of a group that had become known as the Neo-Kraepelinians. Outcasts within American psychiatry during the 1950s and 1960s, these individuals took over the DSM-3. In doing so, the Neo-Kraepelinians attempted to bring psychiatry back to its medical roots. The ideas of the Neo-Kraepelinians also fit well with the transition and treatment focus from psychotherapy to the use of medications, i.e., of course, writing prescriptions. Decker, 2013, described in detail the internal struggles within American psychiatry that were associated with the birth of the DSM-3. In effect, the Neo-Kraepelinians, by creating the DSM-3, changed the entire focus of the mental health field. And here, out to the side, I wrote as a note for the difference of what they're talking about here. This is like the couch talk, sort of confessional style versus giving pills, okay? Which is not altogether ineffective, of course. It is effective, but is it always the best solution? Research between the DSM-3 and the DSM-3R. Measurement. Prior to creating the DSM-3, the leader of that innovative classification system, Robert Spitzer, had formed a partnership with the Washington University psychiatrists to create a broader classification system that would serve as the precursor to the DSM-3. This pre-DSM-3 was called the Research Diagnostic Criteria, RDC, and focused on categories of psychotic and depressive disorders. Spitzer et al., 1975. As the DSM-3 was being created, early drafts of the RDC classification were made available. The result was a large number of research studies that appeared almost immediately after the DSM-3 was published, in which there were empirical comparisons of diagnostic criteria from Feiner et al., the RDC, and the DSM-3. These empirical studies often pointedly demonstrated significant flaws in the diagnostic criteria. This body of research stimulated Spitzer and others from the DSM-3 to begin working on a revised version of the DSM-3 called the DSM-3R, which was intended to correct the diagnostic criteria. In addition to the studies analyzing diagnostic criteria, another innovation followed the publication of the DSM-3, the creation of structured interviews. Spitzer, prior to becoming the leader of the DSM-3, had been performing a series of research studies with a psychologist named Jean Endicott to examine interview-based measures of psychopathology. When the RDC were published, Spitzer, Endicott, and Robbins created a structured interview to assess the diagnostic criteria in the RDC. After the publication of the DSM-3, Spitzer and his colleagues created the SCID, Structured Clinical Interview, for DSM-3R, Spitzer et al., 1990. Other structured interviews that focused on more specific disorders were quickly developed, and by the year 2000, there were over 240 instruments to measure various aspects of psychopathology and mental disorders. The reliability of diagnostic assessment using these new instruments generally was a distinct improvement over what had been found in the pre-DSM-3 research. Spitzer and Fleiss's 1974 review of pre-DSM-3 reliability research showed estimates of interclinician agreement typically ranging from 0.4 to 0.6. Average those, you get the 50% that I mentioned earlier. Using structured interviews like the SCID, reliability estimates were distinctly higher, typically in the range of 0.75 to 0.90. Because of the clearly defined method for assigning psychopathology along with improved reliability, structured interviews would soon dominate the research world, although even today they are rarely used in clinical practice. Research on clinicians. In the same year that the DSM-3 was published, An innovative research study was published by Cantor et al. 1980. This research was proposed on the basis of a prototype model in cognitive psychology to explain how children learn categorical concepts. Cantor et al. 1980 had 13 mental health clinicians list the features that they associated with 9 DSM-2 diagnostic categories of psychosis. Any feature that was chosen by at least 3 of the 13 clinicians was kept for the final feature list. Then they took 12 case histories of patients that had been given one of the 4 psychotic diagnoses: manic, depressed, paranoid schizophrenia, and undifferentiated schizophrenia. 4 cases were considered to be quite prototypical of the 4 diagnoses, i.e. these 4 cases contain almost all of the features generated by the 13 clinicians. 4 were moderately prototypical, and 4 were not typical, i.e. these 4 cases had 4 or less of the defining features generated by the 13 clinicians. These case histories were given to the clinicians to diagnose. The reliability of the diagnoses varied as a function of the prototypicality of the case histories, with the least prototypical cases having the lowest reliability. Research following the Cantor et al. 1980 study suggested that clinicians did not use diagnostic criteria to make diagnoses. Clinicians' diagnoses tended to follow a prototype matching model rather than the criteria-based model. Next section, taxonomy. Alternative classificatory structures only began to appear around the time of the DSM-3. One stimulus for thinking about the organization of psychiatric classification was the development of alternative theoretical approaches to biological classification. In particular, there was a movement in the 1960s and 1970s in which computerized systems were developed to create classificatory systems of living organisms. The school of thought associated with this approach was called numerical taxonomy, and the computerized methods that created these classifications were termed cluster analysis. Lohr and colleagues, 63 and 66, expanded these ideas in an attempt to empirically create classifications of psychotic patients. Other applications of cluster analysis attracted attention in the psychopathology literature. These efforts culminated the later work of Mill to create taxometric methods to investigate the latent structure of psychopathology, 1995. Another stimulus for taxonomic thought was that Spitzer and the organizing committee for the DSM-3 took the bold step of proposing a tentative definition of the concept of mental disorder. They needed this definition because an explicit goal of the creators of the DSM-3 was to avoid speculations about the causal mechanisms, especially theoretical concepts couched in psychoanalytic terms that explained psychopathology. This definition was also in direct contrast to the anti-psychiatry movement that attempted to define a mental disorder as society's way of dealing with undesirable people by labeling them with a mental disorder to keep them quiet and segregated. The definition in the DSM-3 was, each of the mental disorders is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral or psychological syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and that is typically associated with either a painful symptom, distress, or impairment in one or more important areas of functioning, disability. In addition, there is an inference that there is a behavioral, psychological, or biological dysfunction, and that the disturbance is not only in the relationship between the individual and the society. As will become clear below, the DSM-3 definition of mental disorder led to an interesting and growing discussion of psychiatric classification by philosophers, cognitive psychologists, social anthropologists, and historians. I ding the bell on a couple of those. DSM-3R. Because of the research on diagnostic criteria that began appearing almost immediately after the DSM-3 was published, the authors of the DSM-3 decided to update those criteria. However, as often occurs when a committee is formed, the actions of the committee do not always match exactly the goals that were originally intended. The DSM-3R, APA 1987, did contain a number of changes to the diagnostic criteria. The DSM-3R also contained new diagnostic categories that had not appeared in the DSM-3. Structurally, in terms of its multi-axial system, its use of diagnostic criteria, and its organization of the major families of mental disorders, the DSM-3R was the same as the DSM-3, but in terms of specifics, the classification system changed substantially. The DSM-3R was not just a revision, it was a new classification system. The DSM-3R contained a total of 253 categories. There had been 228 in the DSM-3. Of these, 174 were defined using diagnostic criteria. 163 categories in the DSM-3 had criteria. The biggest change was in the sleep disorders. The work group for this family of disorders had not been able to finish in time for the publication of the DSM-3. Thus, this section of the classification was new in the DSM-3R. However, other changes did occur. For instance, inhalant abuse, inhalant dependence, and inhalant addiction were added to the DSM-3R. Schizoid disorder of childhood or adolescence was dropped. The political struggles concerning the DSM-3 centered around a battle between the psychoanalytic faction of the APA and a biologically oriented faction, the Neo-Krepelinians. When the DSM-3R was being created, the focus of controversy shifted. Feminists were concerned with proposals by the DSM-3R committees for new categories such as premenstrual syndrome and masochistic PD. As a result of the controversy, the DSM-3R added a new appendix to its classifications called Proposed Diagnostic Categories Needing Further Study. Contained in this appendix were 3 categories: late luteal phase dysphoric disorder, the new name for premenstrual syndrome, PMS, sadistic PD to balance masochistic PD, and self-defeating PD, the new name for masochistic PD. Politics had shifted the focus of the controversy from the psychoanalytic tradition to feminism. Research between the DSM-3R and DSM-4. Taxonomy. In an important series of publications, Wakefield, 1992, A, B, and 99, criticized the DSM-3 approach to defining the concept of mental disorder. Wakefield argued that an important problem in the DSM-3 definition was that it relied on the concept of dysfunction, but that concept itself was undefined. The danger in defining dysfunction is in avoiding a tautology or circular definition. Quote, a dysfunction occurs when something is not functioning, end quote. The trick then is to determine some independent means of identifying a function or dysfunction. And I wrote out to the side here the ultimate question they're asking is, what does it mean to be, quote, normal versus, quote, abnormal? Wakefield decided, given his concerns about the vagueness of the DSM-3 definition of mental disorder, to offer a definition of his own. Wakefield in 92 offered 2 criteria, harm and dysfunction, which he considered necessary and jointly sufficient for the presence of a mental disorder. Wakefield's harmful dysfunction definition, while not the only attempt to define mental disorder, see Lilienfeld and Marino 95 and 99, is the most debated and examined in the literature. The first part of his definition requires that the condition result in harm for the patient, which must be based on a value judgment. There is no such thing as a harmful condition in nature. Nature is neutral to the concerns of any individual, and so there are no justifiable bases to consider a condition harmful or beneficial without first explicitly stating a certain point of view. For the case of mental disorders, harm can come about in several ways: subjective distress, disability or discomfort, a decrement in functioning in one or more socially defined roles, impeding upon the rights of others, etc. An alternative way of conceptualizing the harm criterion is that it represents a condition of therapeutic concern. In other words, the person, society, or treating clinician values the condition negatively. And I wrote out here to the side that when you have a series of problems with these kinds of people, say drug addiction, constant car crashes are a problem for these people, totally unstable relationships, inability to maintain a job, things like that. Which to me would seem pretty obvious, but I'm not sure how they're missing those bigger points. We continue. The fact that a value judgment is necessary to instantiate any definition of mental disorder has a profound yet often unsettling to many implication. Because the definition of mental disorder, and by extension individual mental disorders, is fundamentally based upon a value judgment, it will always be a moving target. The same symptoms might be judged as disordered in one context, but not in another. Further, as societal and individual values change over time, Some conditions that used to be disordered will no longer be considered abnormal, e.g. homosexuality, and others that were not disordered might become problematic, e.g. internet use. Thus, there can never be a, quote, final version of the DSM. Individual disorder definitions might call upon different values in order to be considered disordered. A single definition of mental disorder as attempted by the DSM-3 or Wakefield contradicts the plurality of the myriad ways a condition might be defined as a disorder. Instead, mental disorder must always be a pluralistic concept, meaning that it has no single definition, but instead a variety of definitions depending upon the context. I'll write out to the side here, I'll give a begrudging maybe to that. The second component of Wakefield's definition of disorder is the idea of dysfunction. In contrast to the value-laden concept of harm, Wakefield proposed that a dysfunction could be scientifically and objectively determined through an understanding of natural functions via the effects they are designed to create on the basis of evolutionary theory. This would be, say, evolutionary psychology or something. However, there are several problems with this definition of dysfunction. First, evolution is not a directed process, meaning that it isn't teleological, and so there is no design for a particular characteristic. Rather, the adaptive value of a characteristic is always a function of the environment in which the organism exists. As environments change, so do the selective pressures and thus the adaptive value of the characteristic in question. Further, the argument that evolution can be used to define mental functions may not hold because mental functions may not be direct adaptations to the environment. Instead, they may be what are called exaptations or characteristics that evolve for some other purpose but currently serve a particular function. For this, they cite Gould, 1991, Lilienfeld and Marino, 95 and 99. In short, Wakefield's essentialist approach to the interpretation of dysfunction has proven untenable when applied to a definition of mental disorder. Despite these problems, the definition of mental disorder has remained relatively unchanged in the DSM. Research on clinicians. In the mid-1980s, another group of research studies using mental health clinicians as participants were conducted with relative frequency, studies of gender bias and diagnosis. These studies were stimulated by two earlier papers. The findings of Broverman and colleagues, 1970, were interpreted to mean that clinicians tend to pathologize women more relative to men. Warner, 1978, used a standard case history that was presented with masculine pronouns to one group of clinicians and with feminine pronouns to another group. Warner, 78, interpreted his results as demonstrating bias by clinicians to use the diagnosis of histrionic personality with women. Both studies had serious methodological flaws. Nonetheless, the conclusions reached by these authors were readily accepted by a number of writers at the time. A reasonably large literature on gender bias followed. This literature often focused on the PDs. Many of the findings were inconsistent across researchers' cases and changes in methodology. The most consistent finding of these studies was that female versions of cases were rated as more histrionic, but even that finding had mixed results. Reviews of the gender bias literature can be found in Garb 98, Whittaker and Spitzer 91. After these initial studies on gender bias and the diagnosis of PDs, the interest in this question decreased and the central issue moved from documenting gender bias to determining the sources of differences in diagnosis based on gender, true prevalence differences in the population, clinician knowledge of population base rates, clinician application of societal stereotypes, etc. The various possible reasons for gender differences in diagnosis are very nicely outlined in Whittaker 98. Other careful analyses argue that research findings are not due to bias but instead reflect gender differences in personality traits underlying Axis 2 diagnoses, Paris 2004. Nonetheless, the mixed results from these various gender bias studies do not show conclusive evidence that clinicians are biased in their diagnosis of PDs. And I wrote out to the side here, or if it is a mere artifact of the categories because they cannot be objectively determined as they were mentioning to be a problem before. In some way, these categories are artificial constructs that are just brought together for organizational purposes, although they do clearly correspond to something that is real. DSM-4. The DSM-2 had been published in 1968 to coincide roughly with the publication of the ICD-8. The The DSM-3 was published in 1980. DSM-3R came out in 1987. The DSM-4 appeared in 1994. Zimmerman, 1988, among others, was quite critical of this rate of change. The researchers needed stability in the definition of categories in order to perform useful studies of psychopathology. Clinicians likewise were confused by and had difficulty adjusting to changes in the fundamental terminology that organized the diagnostic process. Additionally, the rate of scientific discoveries did not support the rapid changes. And I wrote to the side here, yes, because the manual makes them look busy and useful, and they make money on it. That's my cynical approach to it anyway. I continue. The APA chose a new leader for the DSM-4, Alan Francis. He first created the 13 work groups responsible for the various subsections of the DSM-4. The composition of the work groups was designed to contain some holdovers from the DSM-3 and 3R, but generally the majority of each work group represented a new collection of professionals. The initial task of the work groups was to perform careful literature reviews associated with the various diagnostic categories to which each work group was assigned. These literature reviews were intended to guide the decisions of the work groups. In addition, the literature reviews served to identify databases that existed in the United States about different mental disorders. The researchers who had created these databases were asked if they would be willing to contribute their data to the DSM-4 work groups, who then used those data to make decisions about which diagnostic criteria needed alteration. The literature reviews were collected in a 3-volume series of source books. And here we get into some incredibly tremendous bloating problems. The DSM-4 grew to 383 categories. Of these, 201 diagnostic categories were defined using diagnostic criteria. The size of the DSM-4 also grew to 886 pages. The DSM-4 source books, 3 volumes, added 3,010 pages. Another area of considerable growth in the DSM-4 was the appendix for categories needing further study. The DSM-3R had 3. The DSM-4 had 17 categories that needed further study, of which one, medication-induced movement disorders, was further subdivided into 7 subcategories. There were also 3 scales, a defensive functioning scale, global assessment and relational functioning scale, and a social and occupational functioning assessment scale that were included in the to-be-studied appendix. A text revision of DSM-4, DSM-4-TR, was published in 2000. The intention was not to change any criteria, but a few changes did occur, such as dropping the clinical significance criterion for tic disorders and adjusting it to account for non-consenting victims and the paraphilias. Otherwise, only the supporting narrative text was updated. Interestingly, however, the DSM-4-TR increased in length by 57 pages, and the cost of purchase increased from $48.95 for the DSM-4 to $74.95 for the DSM-4-TR. And we see the magnificent results of attempting to generate revenue there. And I also want to point out here a continual issue that you see throughout science. You see this in linguistics, you see it in different fields of anthropology, and you see it here also. You have lumpers and splitters. You have people who separate things into like 3 or 4 large governing categories, and then you have other people who want to separate things into 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, or 100 different categories. Research between the DSM-4 and DSM-5. Taxonomy. As noted above, the value-laden, i.e. harm aspect of Wakefield's definition of mental disorder attracted relatively little criticism. Sadler, 2005, expanded on the idea that values were relevant to psychiatric classification in a book titled Values and Psychiatric Diagnosis, which is one of the most important books published on the topic of psychiatric classification since the DSM-3. Sadler highlighted 5 values and the roles they play in psychiatric nosology. A. Aesthetics, how people prefer things to be in the sense that they like or appreciate them. B. Epistemology, choices about how we know what we know about classification, i.e. what research methods we prefer. C. Ethics, what morals the classification upholds. D. Ontology, what is the fundamental nature of things or in the case of psychiatry, what mental disorders are in a metaphysical sense, and E, pragmatics, how useful or user-friendly the classification might be. Until the publication of this book, most, although not all, of these assumptions were ignored or taken for granted. This book legitimized the imperative role philosophical discourse plays in the development of classification of mental disorders. And I wrote out here to the side, it boggles my mind because this is where philosophers begin. How did they not get onto this earlier? And upcoming here, I have this labeled as a hugely important section. One example of this sort of work is by Haslam, 2002, who discussed a classification of types relevant to psychiatric classification. The inherent idea is that individual mental disorders can be defined in a variety of ways, a taxonomy of kinds of kinds. These kinds vary between true dimensions on one side and true categories on the other, with a variety of intermediary steps. True dimensions represent a continuous range of values, much like the personality trait neuroticism. One can create a cutoff point on the dimension to call one tail neurotic and the other normal, but to do so is to create groups that do not reflect the properties of the underlying measured characteristic. Practical kinds are also continua, but there is a pragmatic basis for defining a cutoff point, like an IQ score of 70 for defining intellectual disability. A practical kind is defined via some value judgment. Fuzzy kinds, however, do present evidence of a natural demarcation between groups, like an overlapping bimodal distribution. Although there is evidence that there are separate groups, these groups may overlap to some degree. Many DSM prototype style categories are examples of fuzzy kinds, owing to their features overlapping with neighboring diagnoses. The final two kinds in Haslam's hierarchy represent true categories, in which any overlap between groups is due to nothing more than chance, i.e., it is not a meaningful reflection of measurement characteristics. The difference between a discrete kind and a natural kind is that natural kinds have a definable essence that causes the separation into groups. Discrete kinds happen to be separate without a clearly defined etiology. Although there are strong arguments against ever finding a mental disorder that would qualify as a natural kind, Haslam wants to reserve the possibility that such a condition could be discovered. A variety of statistical techniques, including taxometrics and factor mixture analysis, have been developed to examine the dimensionality versus taxonicity of diagnostic constructs. Many taxometric studies find that dimensions tend to be favored for a variety of psychiatric disorders, especially the PDs, but the other studies find justification in the measurement characteristics for retaining groups. The point of Haslam's taxonomy is that mental disorder categories might be a variety of kinds. There need not be a unified definition of mental disorder. Other areas of medicine have embraced this plurality in their diagnostic concepts, happily including practical kinds such as hypertension, next to natural kinds like tuberculosis. The DSM-5, APA 2013, authors incorporated an implicit flexible definition of mental disorder, including dimensional models for some disorders and retaining fuzzy prototypes for others, although their explicit definition of mental disorder remains remarkably similar to that in the DSM-3. And out here to the side I wrote that perhaps this is dealing with something that's a bit of artifact of the definitions and the categories versus actual essentialism, meaning that these traits and precisely only these traits fit into one group or another group. A major debate regarding the DSM-5 was how to incorporate dimensional models of personality into the manual. Research supports that normal and abnormal personality are not distinct from one another, and that personality is best represented on a continuum. Markin et al. 2005 published an influential paper on the structure of personality, which demonstrated that both abnormal and normal personalities across multiple measures and samples adhere to a hierarchy that begins with 2 factors and ends with 5. The favored personality model depends upon the level of abstraction one examines. The 2 highest order factors are often referred to as externalizing and internalizing, which are similar to Watson and colleagues' 1988 negative affectivity and positive affectivity. The three-factor solution is made of negative emotionality, disinhibition similar to externalizing, and positive emotionality. The four-factor solution contains negative emotionality and positive emotionality and breaks disinhibition into disagreeable disinhibition and unconscientious disinhibition. Finally, the five-factor solution has negative emotionality, agreeableness, disagreeable disinhibition reversed, conscientiousness, unconscientiousness disinhibition reversed, extroversion, and openness. These last two factors break from positive emotionality. The 4 and 5 factor solutions have generated the most personality models and appear to be the preferred levels of abstraction. And if you listen to the presentations of Dr. Jordan Peterson, you will recognize these 5 traits. That's what he is referring to. With extensive research supporting dimensional models of personality, the DSM-5 PD work group began the process of selecting a model to use in the new manual. Whittaker and Simonson, 2005, compared and contrasted 18 candidate dimensional systems for the DSM-5, all of which were considered potential solutions. However, the DSM-5 PD work group chose to develop their own model, which was largely influenced by the Collaborative Longitudinal Personality Disorders Study, CLPS, in 2000. The National Institute of Mental Health, NIMH, funded this study, and its goals were to examine the stability, course, and outcome of select PDs using a control group of clients with major depressive disorder and no PDs. The study only focused on 4 of the 10 DSM-4 TRPDs: avoidant, borderline, obsessive-compulsive, and schizotypal, chosen for conceptual and logistical issues, they said. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder is a separate, discrete disorder from the other PDs. Schizotypal personality disorder is a prototype of a spectrum disorder. Borderline personality disorder is the most distressing and disabling PD, and avoidant personality disorder is the most prevalent of the PDs. The expected changes for the DSM-5 personality chapter were released on the APA's website in February of 2010. The original proposal was to replace all the PD categories with a dimensional model of personality. However, the political pressures against such a significant change were powerful, and the next version of the proposal involved a hybrid of categories and dimensions. Based on the 2011 proposal, 6 of the 10 categorical diagnoses from DSM-4 were kept: antisocial, avoidant, borderline, narcissistic, obsessive-compulsive, and schizotypal. Each patient would have been rated on a dimensional scale of how much he or she resembled the specific PD. Additionally, 5 proposed domains, each with trait facets, would be rated on a 0 to 4 dimensional scale. The proposed domains were negative affectivity, detachment, antagonism, disinhibition, and psychoticism, roughly corresponding to the 5-factor solution described above, with the exception of psychoticism being conceptualized as qualitatively different than openness. For clients who did not meet criteria for the 6 categorical diagnoses, a diagnosis of personality disorder trait specified would be given with the traits that describe the client listed. The proposed changes strove to alleviate concerns about DSM-4 PDs, such as high rates of comorbidity between PDs, limited validity of some PDs, arbitrary diagnostic thresholds, and instability of PD diagnosis. The committee cited 6 CLPS articles as empirical support for retaining the 6 categorical diagnoses and creating the new dimensional model. As stated above, the CLPS only studied 4 DSM-4 PDs because of methodological reasons, not for empirical ones. No references were given for the exclusion of the remaining PDs, but the committee stated the remaining PDs were dimensional and related to one another. The proposed changes to the DSM-5 quickly generated opposition. Whittaker, 2011, described 4 main concerns about the proposed changes. First, the DSM-5 disregards current literature by ignoring the bipolarity of personality because the proposed dimensions were unipolar. Second, it does not include normal ranges of personality, which are not distinct from PDs. And third, the proposal neglects to cover many important aspects of personality, even with 37 traits. Fourth, Whittaker also took issue with the 2010 proposed changes of turning some of the current PDs like histrionic and narcissistic PDs, into single traits. Although the DSM-5 PD committee struggled to come to a consensus about which dimensions and traits should be included in the new model, the NIMH continued to push a research agenda that examined the underlying systems that contribute to psychopathology, e.g. genetics, epidemiology, cognitive psychology, sociology, and so on. The NIMH developed a plan for a new way of classifying psychopathology that could help identify the causal mechanisms underlying or cross-cutting current DSM syndromes. They termed their project the Research Domain Criteria, RDoC, which encompass multiple levels of analysis ranging from the molecular to the social, with a particular emphasis on the neural circuitry of psychopathology, primarily using genetics and neuroscience methodologies.